Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me. It is our Friday weekend edition, and in this first half hour, we're going to circle back to something we have been doing for many weeks, and that is to have a conversation with Dr. Doug Groothuis, who is an individual that is at Denver Seminary, a graduate of the University of Oregon, University of Wisconsin-Madison. Of course, he's been on this program many times before, going all the way back to the 1980s when he wrote the book Unmasking the New Age, a book I certainly commend to you, his Christian Apologetics, a comprehensive case for Christian faith. And if you've been with us in some of the previous Fridays, we have taken each one of the chapters of his book, Philosophy in 7 Sentences, and then had to take kind of a break, one because of the snow and travel and all sorts of other things. And so if you're one of those keeping score at home, we've had Protagoras, we've had Socrates, we've had Aristotle, we've had Augustine, we've had Descartes, we've had Pascal, and we thought we would finish off the Philosophy in 7 Sentences by looking at Kierkegaard, and each one of them have a sentence. The one for Kierkegaard is probably the longest of any of the others, in which it says, the greatest hazard of all, losing oneself, can occur very quietly in the world as if there was nothing at all. And again, we're going to be talking about Kierkegaard, who we would call, from our kind of modern idea, a very significant introvert who nevertheless provided us with many journals and various books. So, Doug Groothuis, as always, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Yeah, thank you. Happy to be here again, Kerby.
Soren Kierkegaard is somebody that sometimes Christians think shouldn't be put in kind of the Christian groups. In others, they do. And in some respects, you can kind of figure out a little bit about what people know about him based upon their reaction, if they have any reaction at all with him. But you've included it in this particular book, Philosophy in 7 Sentences. So talk about why you thought he was a significant person we should know about.
Well, he is for two main reasons. One, his influence on philosophy, and especially on what's called existentialism, which is a philosophy that's very concerned with human experience and how the self relates to the world. He's simply one of the major philosophers. And then also, as I bring out in the book, he has had a very profound effect on me. In fact, reading parts of one of his books helped me to come to Christ back in 1976. But then there's another part of me that is in opposition to Kierkegaard, and that he was something of a fideist. He didn't think we should use arguments for God's existence or arguments for the historical reliability of the Bible. But he still had an apologetic. He had a way of commending the Christian faith, and that was to bring a Christian understanding of reality to bear on who we are, on the self. So he was trying to open us up to discern our identity before God, to not view ourselves as independent or self-made people, but realize that there was something very troubling about the self, that we're really not naturally at peace with ourselves. And that's what the sentence that I included brings out, that it's easy, even back in his day, in the early to middle 19th century in Denmark, to distract oneself from the ultimate issues of life, matters of the eternal, as he put it.
And again, that's in his book of The Sickness Unto Death. And I do want to talk about the self, because that's kind of a big part of this chapter. But you did say, just very in passing, but it's worth a comment or two. Some people consider Kierkegaard as the father of existentialism. And when I say existentialism, we're talking about people like Albert Camus and Jean-Paul Sartre. But in some respects, Kierkegaard is seen as an individual that gave birth to that idea as well, isn't he?
Yeah, he is, and it's a little dicey because when you think of existentialists like Camus or Sartre or perhaps Nietzsche, they're hardcore atheists, whereas Kierkegaard was a confessional Lutheran. He never strayed from that. And one thing he wanted to do was reform the church. He thought the church had become far too legalistic and externalistic and had not really tapped into the essence of the gospel, which is to give everything to God. He emphasized inwardness, that is, really focusing on the Lord and the challenge of the cross in the Christian life. So you might say, well, how did that kind of an attitude get linked with atheists? And basically it has to do more with subject matter. So existentialists, take that word existence, are concerned with the place of the self in the world. How does the self relate to other selves? And how do we live with ourselves? So instead of starting with some big abstract principle, the way Hegel did, and Kierkegaard did not like Hegel, Kierkegaard wants to start, and existentialists want to start from human experience. Now, Kierkegaard doesn't end there. He thinks that the presence of God, that is God's reality, is known to the self even before we are redeemed through Christ, whereas these other atheistic thinkers think the self is alone in a godless universe.
And so, again, that's kind of interesting because, like you said, he also was against Hegel and his whole system, because Hegel emphasized things, the rational is real and all of the rest. And so, in some respects, this, I think, is the, if you will, the watershed between, say, a religious or Christian existentialism and a atheistic existentialism. But that brings us into the issue of the self, because we're going to probably focus most of our time and attention on that. The quote you have is from The Sickness Unto Death, but we might also add to that another book called Fear and Trembling. So what exactly did Kierkegaard talk about in terms of this idea of the self?
It's pretty complicated, and Kierkegaard is not easy reading. If you tend to like Norman Vincent Peale and positive thinkers and Robert Schuller and things like that, you probably won't be drawn to Kierkegaard. Think of the title of that book, The Sickness Unto Death. It's not exactly the power of positive thinking.
Not exactly.
Right? But what Kierkegaard does is he wants people to look within themselves and to see that they're not really at peace with themselves. It's essentially a problem of conscience, that we can't resolve our desires with our actuality. So we have a sense that we should do certain things. We have duty, but we never completely fulfill that duty. He talks about the despair, a possibility where there seem to be endless things you need to do. You can't do them all. And the other side is the despair of necessity, where things seem to crush in upon you and you don't have enough freedom. So what he's doing in philosophy is called phenomenology. It's a big word that simply means the study of consciousness. And he's not simply looking at the different features of consciousness, like imagination or intentionality or will. He's trying to understand the self in biblical categories.
Yes.
And he believes that when you really attend to your consciousness and your conscience, you see that there's this huge gap between yourself and what is ideal. There's what he calls despair.
Yes.
And he thinks only the gospel can answer that despair.
Let's come back and talk about more of that in terms of God and the self and sin nature and all the rest. We'll continue our conversation with Dr. Doug Groothuis right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Research shows that Americans have less and less in common with each other. There is a problem that the majority of Americans share, knowing what to believe. In 2019, Pew Research Center found that 64% of Americans have a hard time discerning truth when listening to elected officials. 8 in 10 Americans believe Republicans and Democrats disagree about basic facts. The inability of both parties to agree on basic facts seems to be one of the only things the parties do agree on. A significant reason for this widespread distrust and confusion is the fact that fewer and fewer Americans share a common moral code. Increasing numbers of people in our nation are abandoning the Bible as a source of moral truth. Here's a disturbing statistic. 58% of American adults believe that individuals, not God, decide what is morally true, according to research done by Dr. George Barna. This problem is only growing worse among younger Americans. 24% of Gen Z, those born after 1998, believe morality changes over time based on society. We're already seeing the chaotic effects of a morality determined by society's whims. Trusting in an unchanging source of absolute moral truth is more than a spiritual comfort. It provides clarity and confidence for navigating all of life's issues that we face every day. You know, on Point of View, we're committed to helping our listeners navigate any issue they may face by relying on God's Word as the source of moral truth. If you know people who need that kind of moral clarity in their lives, consider pointing them to Point of View, where we discuss relevant issues through a biblical lens. You may also consider donating to Point of View so that we can reach even more listeners with the applicable truth found in God's Word.
Go deeper on topics like you hear on Viewpoints by visiting pointofview.net. Pointofview.net.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Continue your conversation with Dr. Doug Groothuis for a few more minutes as we talk about his book, Philosophy in 7 Sentences, talking about Kierkegaard, and this is one of the things we wanted you to know more about. And, of course, we are quoting from this particular book that he wrote called Sickness Unto Death, and Kierkegaard actually pulls that from kind of the King James translation in the Gospel of John, where Jesus says his friend Lazarus' sickness is not unto death, but uses that, as you were pointing out, Doug, just a minute ago, in terms of kind of a phenomenology of the self. And also, this is where you start seeing some of the Christian ideas, which ultimately get into the conversation about sin and those kinds of things, that the self recognizes there, first of all, as a God, and second of all, recognizes that there's something not quite right.
Exactly. And what Kierkegaard is doing through a very philosophical way of analysis is explain our condition as made in God's image, but also sinful and alienated not only from God, but actually from ourselves. So while so many writers today will talk about finding your true self or unleashing human potential, Kierkegaard's focus is very different. He's looking at the aspirations of the self that cannot be met, and really the problem of guilt and so on. And it's interesting that some of the atheistic existentialists are very open about their hostility to God. That is, they think that they find their true self by affirming an autonomous self, a self independent from God. And I give a quote from Nietzsche to that effect. And you find other thinkers that will just admit it, that they don't want there to be a God.
Right.
And so that's how they will live, Thomas Nagel, who's not an existentialist, has some quotes to that effect that are often repeated because it shows so obviously this tendency we have in fallen human nature to not be able to escape the idea of God, not being able to escape our conscience, but at the same time not being happy about it. So what Kierkegaard is doing is saying, be honest with your failings, your weaknesses. Be honest with this despair at finding the good life on your own, of being at peace with yourself. And then realizing, then you need to realize that there is hope. And that hope is found from outside of yourself, but found in a God who is profoundly concerned with who you are. And so if you read The Sickness Unto Death, you won't get a kind of Billy Graham presentation of the gospel, but you get a very philosophically nuanced, phenomenologically oriented gospel message, essentially. And that's exactly what God used in my life back in early 1976 when I was taking a philosophy course. We had to read some Kierkegaard, and the first thing that I read was a secondary source that was not positive towards Kierkegaard. It was W.T. Jones's History of Philosophy, and he was very hostile to religion. But then one night, I had a very bizarre dream, and I woke up. I was in my dorm room by myself, and I randomly opened The Sickness Unto Death and started reading. And what the book said was really who I was. It was saying that some people sense this presence of God, but they don't want to have anything to do with God, so they try to build an identity on defying God. He called it defiant despair. And I realized that, there I was as a freshman in college reading the atheists like Marx and Nietzsche and Freud and wanting to be totally free of God and assert my own identity against the world and against God. And when I read Kierkegaard describing me perfectly and saying that this is how you are understood according to Christianity, I thought, there may just be something to Christianity. So that kind of subjective apologetic or applying the Christian understanding of the self psychologically was quite profound to me. And there's a lot more to apologetics than that. I think Kierkegaard was wrong to swear off natural theology and historical evidences and so on, but that sense of discerning the nature of the self according to Christian categories is a very profound. Apologetics, you also find that in Blaise Pascal, who's really my favorite philosopher. We talked about him last week.
Yes. And again, I appreciate the fact you put that in there, because here you are in your dorm room and you said, after reading the book, I realized the book was reading me and explained to me in ways I'd never considered, in ways that were not at least very flattering who you are. And so that kind of gets into the section you have about not only God and the self, but also Kierkegaard and sin, because in some respects, that's something that separates him rather dramatically from the other existentialists and many of the other philosophers, doesn't it?
Oh, definitely, because he was a Christian. He was a faithful Lutheran, although he had his problems with the church, especially at the end of his life. But he realized that sin is something that dogs all of us. And in fact, he overstated it. He said, in comparison to God, we're always in the wrong. Mm-hmm. I think that's an overstatement, because we can please God through the Holy Spirit and the leadership of Christ and so on. But his point was that there is this gap between God and human beings. And one of the things he didn't like about the philosophy of his day through Hegel was that God was more of a universal process working in and through everything, and the individual basically dissolved in this total cosmic developmental organism. And Kierkegaard said, no, we are individuals before God. He really stressed the accountability and responsibility of the individual before God, which can be ignored or can be suppressed through bad religion or through bad philosophy, as he understood Hegel.
Just before we run out of time, again, we've worked our way through every one of these 7 philosophers, and again, the book is entitled Philosophy in 7 Sentences. We have a link to it, so if you would like to get it in paperback or Kindle, it's very inexpensive, and it was published by InterVarsity. But as we have the last couple of minutes, talk about what we can learn, whether it's from Kierkegaard or even some of the others that I've mentioned here today, whether it's Pascal, who we, of course, talked about last time, or Descartes, or all the way back to some of the Greeks like Socrates and Aristotle. There is some value to that, and one of the reasons we did this, we recognize people are not going to read some of these philosophical tomes like you do, but you're giving us a chance to kind of dip in and recognize that we are the inheritor of many of these ideas that come from some of these philosophers, aren't we?
Well, we are. And I tell my students all the time that we should outthink the world for Christ. So that means we need to know something about the great thinkers of the ages and how they affect our ideas and our practices today. And there are some very helpful, wise Christian philosophers we can draw from, and I did in the book, particularly fond of Augustine and Pascal and Kierkegaard. I have some sympathies with Descartes as well. So we can find people who are trying to apply and defend their faith philosophically, and then we can also read non-Christian philosophers who have something good to say, like Socrates and Aristotle, and some we're going to really end up disagreeing with quite a bit, as I do with Protagoras. And I don't know if I'll be able to do it. I'd actually like to write a book called Philosophy in 7 Bad Sentences, and just find the worst sentences ever uttered by philosophers and criticize them. And that's the discipline of basically negative apologetics, where you take a non-Christian idea and try to critique it and refute it. But I've got to interest a publisher in that idea, so we'll see how that goes. But I've got 7 or 10 sentences in mind.
Yeah, Rousseau and Nietzsche, and of course Marx and Rorty and Sartre, Derrida, Kant.
Yeah,
I read that, and I'm ready to read the book, and you haven't even written it yet. So again, that's one of those.
Okay, well, I'll have to write it for you, Kerby.
Yeah, we have got to get that one on, or even as you're writing it, maybe we can get it on. But let me just, before we run out of time, mention that we do have a link to Doug Groothuis's website. If you don't know how to spell his name, that's fine. It's at pointofview.net, but that will tell you a little bit more. His most recent one is a philosophy of lecture outline, and one of those is where he's quoting from Alaska. And I was thinking about you. I was up in Fairbanks, Alaska, and Anchorage, Alaska the other day, and of course I know that's where you grew up, and so I was thinking about you and your wife, and it was a great opportunity to talk to some of our radio stations up there.
Good. Well, you went there in the winter?
Of course. I wanted to go there to warm up. It was actually warmer in North Pole, Alaska a couple of Mondays ago than it was here in Dallas, Texas when they had the Snowmageddon. So.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Right.
Anyway, and of course, they have the outdoor ice sculptures. That's one of the reasons we went up there as well, which they don't even have to put them inside. It's just cold enough there. They just sculpture the ice right out there. Anyway, if you would like to contact Doug Groothuis, let me encourage you to do so. I think we're coming out of COVID, and you could invite him to come and speak. If you'd like to read some of his articles, we have all of that on our website at pointofview.net. And Doug, I'm looking forward to the next opportunity. Maybe it will be bad philosophy in 7 sentences, but thank you for joining us today.
Okay. Well, thank you so much, Kerby. Take care.
We'll take a break, and when we come back, Penna Dexter and Lathan Watts with us as we start our weekend edition.
Where does moral truth come from? According to 58% of Americans, individuals determine moral truth. A quarter of Generation Z says society determines moral truth, and morality can even change over time. Only 42% of Americans believe that truth comes from God. I don't know about you, but I find these numbers extremely troubling. It really is a crisis of truth, and that crisis has consequences. Look at society. Evil is called good, good called evil. People with biblical beliefs are called bigots, or worse, they're canceled. But there is hope. The Bible promises the truth will set us free, and that's why Point of View is relentless in our commitment to the ultimate source of moral truth, God's Word. At Point of View, we know that God's truth is eternal, and if we stand together, we can help more Americans apply His truth in their daily life. Help Americans find truth again by giving at pointofview.net or call 1-800-347-5151. That's pointofview.net and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Privileged to have in the studio with us today. It is our weekend edition. Penna Dexter, of course, co-host of Point of View. Lathan Watts, who is the Director of Public Affairs for First Liberty Institute. You know, we had Judge Ken Starr on Monday, Lathan, and I thought he would be a good warm-up act for you there at First Liberty. And he said a lot of very nice things about First Liberty, and of course, Penna had a chance to.
I listened to the interview, Kerby. It was great, and he did. He had First Liberty was a great example that he continued to give And Kelly's name was mentioned over, really upholding religious liberty, which is what his book is about.
Yes, and so very good book, by the way, which we would commend to you, but also just a good indication of why we need support, ADF and First Liberty and those kinds of things. And one thing, since you did hear that, Penna, that I appreciated is that for some of us, even maybe law students, you read about this in a book or something else, but when you know those individuals, as Lathan or Kelly has talked about, the Bakers in Oregon or Coach Kennedy or whatever, well, the same thing with Ken Starr. We're talking about equal access in the Mergens cases. Oh, Bridget Mergens, bless her heart.
She knows them.
He knows
He
all
knows
these
them.
people, and he's argued 36 cases before the Supreme Court. So there's a sense in which you can learn some great legal principles, but he has this ability to communicate just as plain folks, and I just kind of love that. So anyway, just had nothing to do other than the fact that I'm sitting across from a lawyer who probably benefited a little bit from some of the PR that Ken Starr created.
I'm glad he wrote the book. I think it was important that he wrote the book at this time.
Very good book. A very good overview. Okay, this hour we have probably more people listening in the state of Texas, and my first article here, Matthew McConaughey. A couple of weeks ago, I thought, well, no chance. It's getting more likely that it's a possibility. And Penna, you've got the article we've posted here. What's your thoughts?
Well, I'll say that it would be, people are speculating. He's made comments to make people think that he could run for governor of Texas. The election will take place November 8th, 2022. We do not have term limits in Texas for governors. So Greg Abbott will run again. And so, the question is, will Matthew McConaughey, if he runs, run as a Republican or a Democrat? Because we really don't know what he is. And, will he try to primary Greg Abbott? Will he run as a libertarian, which that's some of what he shows. And so, I just don't know which party he would run as. I think that a lot of people are upset with the current governor, Greg Abbott. I mean, to me, it's a case of politicians who were supposed to win because of COVID, they had their plans upset. Donald Trump is a prime example, but I think Greg Abbott too, because people were really upset with him over some of the directives as we had lockdowns in Texas. They were stronger than a lot of conservatives like, but then there's a lot of people in Texas now, and it's becoming more diverse. And then, of course, this whole meltdown with our electrical grid was not good for Greg Abbott. But maybe unfairly blamed, but still. So I think now, my opinion is, and Lathan knows a lot more about Matthew McConaughey and his positions, but I do think that this is a wake-up call for the legislature that's meeting right now, and also for Greg Abbott, the governor.
If you end up with a legislature that ends up being a do-nothing legislature and doesn't do anything like tax reform and barely can even draw the congressional districts and all sorts of other things, there may be a real opportunity for an outsider to come in and win. What's your thoughts, Lathan?
I am fascinated by the prospect of this as just as a political nerd. Just the opportunity to watch this, if it does happen, is tantalizing to me. Mm-hmm. I personally, really don't like celebrity candidates.
Yeah.
Just it almost just the fact that he's a really, really good actor. Okay. I really admire his work as an actor. How does that in any way qualify you to tell me what good policy is?
Yes.
Right. And I would say the same, for, really it was some of my initial thoughts on Donald Trump.
Yeah.
You're a really, really successful businessman. You're a really successful TV star. But just the whole idea of the celebrity candidate is something I'm sort of, a knee-jerk reaction is always a no.
Yeah.
But McConaughey in Texas is might be the exception to that rule. And I say that because I am a big fan of his work. And so I've watched a lot of interviews that he's done over the years, some about, the entertainment business, and some just, he's done some podcast interviews. I think one with Joe Rogan that was really long and actually, has time to discuss things, not just, speaking sound bites for 15 minutes when you're on, the Tonight Show or whatever. And excuse me, he's an interesting guy.
Yes.
And he has, you can tell there's depth to him, and he's an intelligent guy. He's spent some time thinking through things. I haven't read his book. I've heard him speak about it, and some of the things that are in that book, kind of like Penna said, kind of give you an idea, maybe where he falls along the political spectrum a little bit. I think he's probably more, more libertarian, just to the right of center, which makes for, again, a very interesting prospect as a potential candidate, because, there's definite unhappiness within the conservative movement in Texas with Governor Abbott, with the legislature. And so I think Abbott is vulnerable to a primary challenger, a serious primary
and maybe even
opponent.
vulnerable in the general election, which it's been a long time since the Democrats won at the statewide level, right?
Ann Richards is the last Democrat to win a statewide race in this state, and that's why
it's amazing.
If McConaughey runs, if he was listening to me, I would tell him, I don't think even you can win as a Democrat statewide in Texas. Still, it's becoming more and more competitive. But you look at the Beto O'Rourke race, when it was the sole focus of the entire Democratic Party, of the entire nation, all the money, all the help, everything that he had, and a poorly run Ted Cruz campaign, and he still couldn't win statewide in Texas. So I also think, even as likable as McConaughey is to the public, I think the sort of core agenda of the Democratic Party right now is still out of touch with a voting majority in Texas, which is why they have not won the state house. They haven't won a statewide race. Third party candidates are rarely successful.
That's right.
Almost never. So he has a really sort of delicate sort of minefield to tap dance through. Mm-hmm. If you run as a third party, or as an independent, you have to pull enough votes from both parties to win. And if he ran as a Republican in the primary, Abbott will immediately go after him on the right. He will have to take a position on social issues, which in most things where I've heard him speak, he doesn't really get into that thing. Some of the things he says kind of give you an idea of what he might think on those things. But Abbott would for sure come at him from the right. So it would take a really good team, and some smart people helping him sort of navigate this thing. But it could be really, really fun to watch.
So this article that we posted by Brandon Morse actually floats the idea that the religious right may actually be excited about him. I mean, he's spoken about his faith, but we really don't know how much like a Christian faith that he might have would inform policy positions on the core social issues of the quote-unquote religious right. And so, that's interesting. And that's another one of those unknowns. Speaking of celebrities, I'm from California, and I watched a celebrity politician end up president, Ronald Reagan. And it was like, people scratch their heads at first when this person starts to run for office, when he ran for governor. But he was such a great governor of California that when he did start floating the idea of running for president, it was like so many people were really excited about it. And I was just in the thick kind of there.
But he was running as a governor.
He was running as a governor,
he had
so
a
he had the
record as
political
governor
experience.
to run
But
on.
when he ran for governor, so it's kind of
Correct.
the same situation. It's just a long, long time ago.
Mm-hmm.
You were probably not even born.
He's the first president I remember.
Okay, yeah. So that was Reagan, but then there was another one who I thought was pretty much of a debacle, which was Arnold Schwarzenegger, who ran for governor also. Being in a political family that was actually a Democrat family. His wife was Maria Shriver, and no longer his wife. But so, I don't know. I mean, usually it's not a resume builder, but at times it is. And certainly you can give a speech well and be out in front of the public and do a good job in that sense.
Well, again, Jesse Ventura. You can think of a few others
Yeah, Jesse
that didn't
Ventura
turn
was
out
one that
so
didn't turn out
well.
well.
Al Franken as a senator. I mean,
Exactly.
so, most of the time it doesn't work out, but Ronald Reagan was definitely a success. And Penn and I grew up in California, and I even have an autograph from the governor, Ronald Reagan. We'll be right back.
On 3 successive days last week, 3 disturbing stories appeared in my inbox. The first reported that Amazon is blocking sales of the book When Harry Became Sally, responding to the transgender moment. The author is Ryan Anderson, who made a name for himself as a brilliant scholar at the Heritage Foundation and was recently appointed president of the Ethics and Public Policy Center. We occupy a bizarre moment in history when lots of people believe, and others pretend to believe, that a person's sex is not biological but assigned at birth. And if they want to change it, they can do so by altering their body. Dr. Anderson is simply the latest truth teller to be canceled for explaining the science regarding gender. He does so with clarity and compassion, concluding that the best biology, psychology, and philosophy all support an understanding of gender as a social manifestation of bodily sex. The next day, I received a story describing a bill that's been introduced in the California Assembly that, if approved, will require retailers to display children's clothing, toys, and other items for kids together in a gender-neutral fashion. California-based stores selling these products online will have to show them in a unisex or gender-neutral format. Retailers will be fined $1,000 per violation. The bill states that keeping boys' and girls' items separate, quote, implies that their use by one gender is inappropriate. And then a headline from ABC News. A Mr. No More. Mr. Potato Head goes gender neutral. After manufacturing and marketing Mr. Potato Head for 70 years, Hasbro announced a gender-neutral new name, Potato Head. They're now reconsidering, but a new Potato Head playset to be released this fall will allow kids to create families with 2 moms or 2 dads. When media giants can cancel truth tellers, when state legislators can bully retailers to blur gender distinctives, when toy makers indoctrinate children, the transgender moment threatens to become a permanent reality. For Point of View, I'm Penna Dexter.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, Penna Dexter, Lathan Watts in studio with us. And in the next hour, we're certainly going to spend some time talking about the $1.9 trillion bill that certainly is not only putting an enormous amount of financial weight on our children and grandchildren, but more importantly, tucked inside that bill have all sorts of questions. And one of those maybe relates a little bit to the state of Texas, because Penna, as I think I've mentioned the other day, but let's get into it more detail. In the bill, it says, okay, if you receive any funds from the federal government, then you can't cut taxes. Well, at the moment, Texas legislature's talking about cutting taxes, but you go to some of these other states that look like they really are going to try to cut taxes. Mississippi, Arkansas, for example. I'm using that because I know Lathan's lived in those cities and towns and states and things like that. And a couple others are talking about this. And so I'm sure right now some of the Texas legislators say, good, I'm glad we don't have a bill to cut taxes because we wouldn't be allowed by the federal government. Isn't that crazy?
That's ridiculously crazy. And, we just were talking about the governor race. And certainly people are still not really happy about property taxes in Texas. So, not to be able to cut taxes here it would probably elect somebody else, maybe other than the governor. Who knows?
Yeah.
I mean, that's not, to hear that excuse, well, we couldn't because the federal government wouldn't let us. That's not a very Texan statement.
No, they should do it anyway.
Yeah.
And set up a court battle.
That's
and
right.
Just say you don't have any authority to set tax rates in Texas. Show me that in the enumerated powers of the federal government in the Constitution.
I would think that would be challenged in the Supreme Court, and that would eventually be victorious in terms of those who would want to cut taxes, don't you think?
Yes, I think so. And so anyone who uses that as the excuse
Yes.
of why we didn't cut taxes this legislative session is a coward, frankly. And I'm one of those people who are sick to death of hearing Republicans run for state legislature and statewide office and talk about, how much they how conservative they are, and how much they hate high taxes and can't wait to get to Austin and cut taxes. And then your version of tax relief is, well, we passed this thing that said they can only increase your taxes by X percent. I mean, we used to make, I say we because I'm conservative, we used to make fun of the other party when they would talk about we cut spending when all they did was reduce the rate of increase.
Right.
It was going to increase by 5%. We only increased it by 4%. Wow. What a big cut in spending. No, you increased it by 4%. That's the exact same thing that the other side used to do that we used to make fun of them for. The Republican Party controls both houses of the legislature, every statewide office in Texas. There is zero excuse, none, for not having meaningful property tax relief and other tax relief. The fact is, if it doesn't get done, it's because you didn't want it to get done.
Yeah.
You didn't use everything available to you to get it done.
It just also shows how unfair, in a sense, or unbalanced this bill is. This $1.9 trillion bill, $350 billion to state and local governments, nearly $200 of it to the states. So, the blue states will not use it to cut taxes. They are not at risk of doing that. They're paying,
they're putting the money in the pensions.
Right, into the pensions, or, badly managed pensions, badly managed government programs. So it's really a bailout for states for things that happened well before COVID. So the red states, in a sense, and states have not, especially red states, have not done as badly during the pandemic, and many cities in red states, as a lot of people feared and expected. So it will be somewhat of a windfall for some of those states, and so that's why they're scared to death that they will cut taxes and, make people happy in their states and keep their states red. Because that's not the point of this bill. It's the opposite.
Every state has to balance its budget. Unfortunately, the federal government does not. So how does Texas balance its budget? And if it doesn't balance its budget, or balances it by pulling money from the rainy day fund, saying, well, we had Snowmageddon, so now we can pull all the money out of the rainy day fund, I think that makes it more difficult for some of these representatives and some of these state senators and the governor for running for re-election. What's your thoughts?
Yeah, I think they're going to have a tough time explaining that to Republican primary voters. This is the easiest way to get yourself a primary opponent, is to not do what we sent you there to do. Texas has a little bit of a unique challenge when it comes to budgeting, in that the legislature only meets every other year.
Right.
So you have to basically forecast and budget for 2 years. But that's still no excuse. How long has it been that way? This is what we elect you to do. It should be, usually is, priority number one of a legislative session. You have to get the budget done.
Right. And this time you also have to redistrict. And that's another. If you get at least two things done, at least you can say you've done something. And I'm thinking that right now it's looking tough for them to actually do either of those by the end of the session.
Yeah, the redistricting, they're a little bit at the mercy of getting the census data. And when they get the census data,
which came in late,
coming in late. So it will likely take a special session to do that, because it is such a convoluted and hyper-partisan activity anyway. But yeah, I mean, you have, every 10 years, that legislative session is usually consumed with two things: the budget and redistricting. Okay. This time they had, the Snowmageddon, and the failure of ERCOT. So, you've got, 2 or 3 things that you really have to get done.
And if you don't get those done, I think there are going to be some very upset voters.
Yeah, prepare yourself for a primary opponent, because you will get one. because that's a relatively easy case to make. This is what you said you were going to do, and you didn't do it. Why don't you give me a shot? Whoever that primary opponent is, that's going to be their campaign. So you would think out of their own political self-interest, they would take all the necessary measures to get this done, and they still somehow manage not to. The jury's still out on this legislative session because it's still going on. So we'll have to wait and see. But somebody in Austin needs to light a fire under these folks to get this done, or there's going to be real political fallout in the fall and next spring.
You have two people with the Public Utilities Commission that have stepped down, and also we encourage the head of ERCOT to find employment elsewhere. But does any of that go back to the governor, lieutenant governor, anything like that? What's your thoughts? Because people right now still have in the back of their minds sitting in a cold, dark, waterless house.
Yeah, I was one of them for about 3 days. And some of the ERCOT members, did the right thing and resigned immediately. But did Governor Abbott call for the resignation of anybody?
Not that I know of.
I've never heard him do it.
Yeah.
That's a 2-minute press conference.
Yeah.
That's good politics and it's good policy. And I mean, it's one of those things where the rare occasions where those two things line up. But he didn't.
Yeah.
Dr. Merrill Matthews, when he was here right during and after Snowmageddon, he said that, it wasn't as if we didn't know something like this could happen. And so you cannot give our legislature and our governor complete passes at all, that nothing was done to prepare the grid for cold weather. I don't know exactly how or when or, the decision-making progression, but they certainly don't get a pass, and the buck always stops with your governor and with their leaders. So, yeah, I think it really hurts, and they have to deal with it now. And that, part of I think their public perception of them will be how they deal with it now.
Again, there may not be any other event between now and the primaries, but we've already had certainly COVID, the pandemic, the lockdown. Of course, right now we'll talk about what's going on in Minneapolis because you now have the George Floyd issue. And if that was not enough for 2020, well, we then in 2021 made sure that everybody was in the cold, dark, waterless homes like Lathan was.
And then they're getting rid of the mask mandate. Wonder why.
So here we go. Anyway, we're going to take a break. When we come back, the National Hour, we're going to focus on where did that $1.9 trillion go? We'll talk about that right after this.
Where does moral truth come from? According to 58% of Americans, individuals determine moral truth. A quarter of Generation Z says society determines moral truth, and morality can even change over time. Only 42% of Americans believe that truth comes from God. I don't know about you, but I find these numbers extremely troubling. It really is a crisis of truth, and that crisis has consequences. Look at society. Evil is called good, good called evil. People with biblical beliefs are called bigots, or worse, they're canceled. But there is hope. The Bible promises the truth will set us free, and that's why Point of View is relentless in our commitment to the ultimate source of moral truth, God's Word. At Point of View, we know that God's truth is eternal, and if we stand together, we can help more Americans apply His truth in their daily life. Help Americans find truth again by giving at pointofview.net. Or call 1-800-347-5151. That's pointofview.net and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective,
and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. Each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me. It is our weekend edition. Of course, last night we had President Joe Biden give an address. He's yet to do a press conference, but he did give an address. And so we will be talking about that. And of course, mentioning for quite some time during not only that speech, but in other contexts, the $1.9 trillion bill that passed first the House, then the Senate, back at the House, and then was signed by him. We're going to spend some time talking about what is in it. We're going to get into some of the other aspects of how that is going to affect your home state where you are hearing this broadcast today. And we'll talk about some of the vaccines and a variety of other topics. Penna Dexter with me, as well as Lathan Watts, who's the Director of Public Affairs at First Liberty. But Penna, last night, the president assured us that this is money well spent. First of all, $1.9 trillion. Isn't that more than the entire budget of Canada? There was a time, I'm old enough to remember a time when they used to complain about the fact that when Ronald Reagan left office, we were at about a $1.9 trillion national debt, and this time in one bill. But you've done some research to figure out what's actually in that bill, and there were a lot of things the president didn't mention last night, so we're going to spend some time talking about it today on Point of View.
There's a lot, and we have to remember that this is after $4 trillion in COVID relief/stimulus that was passed in 2020. So it's another, half again. The Wall Street Journal basically calls this the COVID welfare state, which is what it brings into existence. President Biden gave a speech last night after having signed this bill. And Jason Riley at the Wall Street Journal said that the relief package, quote unquote, relief package, is the largest expansion of the welfare state since LBJ's signature program. And he says today's liberals also share with their 1960s precursors the abiding belief that government is best suited to help the underprivileged. The objective is to widen as much as possible the eligibility requirements to public assistance and ask as little as possible from the recipients in return. And that's one of the things that I think it's tax season right now. So people are paying their taxes, that working people, a large share of their income goes to the federal government. And so you look at this idea that under even the Clinton administration and beyond, there's been this shift in welfare that you should work to get it, that, you should be as much as possible working, trying to get a job, training, and all of that. This guts that in so many ways. And I think that kind of underlying principle and the idea that you see the Democrats floating all kinds of things like guaranteed income. Oh, well, some Republicans too. But, separating the ability to be able to live your life and operate your family from the ability to make a living, making it harder to make a living, making it harder for businesses. And, you look at that, and that's why, as with other bills like H.R. 1, you wonder about the future of our country and if, things are going in this direction. So what's in the bill? Well, this is posted at pointofview.net. And, I'm not going to list everything. I'll just start at some of the worst. $1.9 trillion in new debt. Where's it going to be? Who's going to pay for it? Our children and grandchildren, or some other wacky scheme that's not going to be good. And, this could be, a lot of economists are saying this could be the straw that breaks the camel's back for inflation. We've avoided inflation, a problem with inflation for a long time. But, Kerby, you and I lived through the last big inflationary spiral, and it wasn't pretty. The real total, this piece says could be even higher, up to $4.1 trillion in new debt. This is according to the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget.
Wow.
And as I mentioned before, blue state bailouts, $350 billion going through a fund. It's given out with a formula, and that formula is biased toward primarily Democrat-run states. And if you are a red state, you can't raise your taxes if you get some money. So hundreds of billions more dollars than what estimates say is needed. So they're just kind of handing out money. Another is, for instance, here's one for a city, San Francisco, $600 million just for San Francisco, nearly erasing the city's budget deficit after it spent money on free alcohol, marijuana, and tobacco to homeless people. So, localities that are doing everything that you disagree with, now your taxpayer money or your kids' money is going to pay for that. What else? Most of it is unrelated. And this is the amazing part. I think there's just a very small percentage that is actually relief or stimulus, and most of it is unrelated to COVID. It doesn't affect COVID. A lot of it was done either well before COVID, that money was spent. The education dollars are not going to be all the way spent out until 2028. So, really what it is a welfare expansion bill. Okay, there's a lot of foreign aid in there, too, and we can talk about that. $1.7 billion for Amtrak.
Amtrak. Yeah.
That's amazing. And $86 billion for a pension bailout that predates COVID-19. So all these badly run pensions that we always hear about, that the states are perpetuating, and some red states are trying to work on theirs and change those policies so the pensions aren't breaking the bank. Well, this just bails out pensions to the tune of $86 billion. Money for humanities, arts, and museums, $470 million. Money to the EPA for health outcome disparities from pollution. $20 million for language preservation. I hate to see what that really means. Could be different kinds of language that we don't quite understand right now. Less than 10%, according to this organization, goes to directly combat COVID-19. That's just disgusting. And, the Republicans did try to put forward a bill that was about $600 billion. And, they were none of their ideas were accepted. There were lots of amendments then proposed to this bill to try to make it more targeted to COVID-related things. Those are all listed also in this piece that's posted at pointofview.net, and they were all rejected.
Yeah. Lathan?
Well, the R's can't seem to ever learn the lesson that if the other side is taking the approach of being Santa Claus, and you come in to say, well, I'll be Santa Claus, but I'll give you a little bit less, guess who they're going to go with? They're going to go with Santa Claus. It has never worked, and it never will work. They should stand up and say, this is morally wrong. You are robbing your grandchildren to bail out things that have nothing to do with this. And by the way, the first $4 trillion that they printed and spent on this issue has not even all been spent yet. So why do we need another $1.9 trillion? And we're talking in the break about where this money's going. The better question is, where is it coming from? Mm-hmm. Because we don't have this money. It's monopoly money. It printed out of thin air. And you're right, all the way back to Reagan, ours had talked about deficit reduction, and everybody was all up in arms because the deficit, national debt reached $1 trillion. We're at $28 trillion. We don't have this money, and all of the things that are in it, most of it has nothing to do with COVID. They call these bills Christmas trees in D.C. for a reason, because once it's on its way, everybody just hangs an ornament as to what they want on it.
So, President Biden spoke in this speech last night about people that suffered during COVID, and there are some. But there are many who actually did better. The personal savings rate went up, and yet this bill, money's going out to just about everybody.
We'll talk about that and take your phone calls right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Research shows that Americans have less and less in common with each other.
There is a problem that the majority of Americans share, knowing what to believe. In 2019, Pew Research Center found that 64% of Americans have a hard time discerning truth when listening to elected officials. 8 in 10 Americans believe Republicans and Democrats disagree about basic facts. The inability of both parties to agree on basic facts seems to be one of the only things the parties do agree on. A significant reason for this widespread distrust and confusion is the fact that fewer and fewer Americans share a common moral code. Increasing numbers of people in our nation are abandoning the Bible as a source of moral truth. Here's a disturbing statistic. 58% of American adults believe that individuals, not God, decide what is morally true, according to research done by Dr. George Barna. This problem is only growing worse among younger Americans. 24% of Gen Z, those born after 1998, believe morality changes over time based on society. We're already seeing the chaotic effects of a morality determined by society's whims. Trusting in an unchanging source of absolute moral truth is more than a spiritual comfort. It provides clarity and confidence for navigating all of life's issues that we face every day. You know, on Point of View, we're committed to helping our listeners navigate any issue they may face by relying on God's Word as the source of moral truth. If you know people who need that kind of moral clarity in their lives, consider pointing them to Point of View, where we discuss relevant issues through a biblical lens. You may also consider donating to Point of View so that we can reach even more listeners with the applicable truth found in God's Word.
Go deeper on topics like you hear on Viewpoints by visiting pointofview.net. Pointofview.net.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Once again, if you'd like to join the conversation, it's 1-800-351-1212. Lathan Watts, Penna Dexter with us. And Penna, just before we take some phone calls, because you know what? Phone calls are already coming in, so we'll take some of those. 1-800-351-1212. Maybe you have some thoughts about this. And last night, the president said, there were people saying, well, Mr. President, tell the truth. I guess when he was a candidate, tell the truth. Well, we're telling the truth, and that is an enormous amount of this bill has nothing to do with COVID-19, and it is a Christmas tree full of little ornaments that everybody's been sticking on there, and it is a wish list. But you mentioned something just in passing that I think we need to come back to before I take my first phone call, and that is that there are a good number of individuals that did not lose their job, are making a very substantial income, that are going to get the benefits from this as well. And the Republican view was, let's have something more targeted. If you've lost your job, if your business went bankrupt, certainly maybe we can help you because this lockdown was done against you. It's not like you made any mistakes. You suffered. But when you have people, I heard Mark Levin the other day calculating what a couple that maybe a husband and wife combined make $150,000, because he used a more extreme example. But then when he was adding up the couple, their 2 kids, and all this kind of stuff, these people who probably still have their job, probably don't have any financial needs at all, could get a check from the government or a transfer to their bank account of as much as $12,000. This is the problem with this. It's not targeted at all, is it?
Yeah, yay for them. Good. That'll be nice to get. But who pay? Again, is the question we always have to ask. Where's it coming from? Who's paying for it? I had a couple people that I talked to during this tax season. One, they're both millennials. One said, okay, this was my tax bill. It was like an astronomical amount of money.
Wow.
That this person told me, and I thought, it made me think of this bill. I'm thinking, okay, you work hard, you've got a great job, you made this money, you're paying it to the government, and guess what? It's just being given out. It's just being given out, all kinds of programs, mostly to the left for leftist causes. The other person was barely in that position that Mark Levin mentioned. So they'll get a nice check. They could probably use it, but they're conservative and they're mad because they see that this is not fair. And it wasn't targeted. They still have a job. They still have an income and a home and all of that. So, what's happened is the savings rate has gone up. And part of the reason is because businesses suffered so much. So many have closed. You can't go to a store to buy your clothes. You have to buy it online. And for a lot of people, they just rather not. So people have money in their pocket. They don't have anywhere to spend it. I mean, this is part of the country. There is a part that's suffering. And certainly that's why I thought with the earlier bills last year, that, for instance, the paycheck protection part, where even though it didn't always go to deserving businesses, but as much as it did go to deserving businesses to help keep paying people, and then if you did use it for payroll, it wasn't a loan, it was a gift. So that it made some sense. And then you had, I thought maybe boosting unemployment a little bit was helpful, but it's also been hurtful because now companies aren't able to get people back. They make too much staying at home and collecting unemployment from the state and from the federal government. So, all of these policies have impact, and most of it is not going to be a good impact on the economy. Yes, there'll be some people that it will help, and there'll be Democrat constituencies that they'll hope that they get, maybe some gains in Congress instead of losing people. I think that's what this is aimed at. It's not aimed at COVID relief and stimulus.
Well, and you mentioned like the unemployment, the federal government getting involved in paying for unemployment, which has never been done. We talked about Reagan earlier. One of my favorite quotes of his, the closest thing to eternal life on earth is a government program. Yeah. Once the government starts doing something,
there you go.
It will never stop.
Katie bar the door.
This bill extends that federal unemployment assistance, I think, through November. Guess what will happen in November? There'll be guaranteed. There'll be, if we get rid of this, people are going to suffer. We can't get rid of this. And now you got the federal government involved in unemployment. And look, I understand what it means to be. I've been there. Okay, there's no doubt that people are suffering. The problem is the idea that government can alleviate all suffering. It cannot be done. Okay, it's not uncompassionate to say government is incapable of doing this. If you want to help the economy, you want to help people who need help, let them go back to work.
Yes.
That when the economy opens up again and people are allowed to go back to work, all this money that's going to schools and teachers, none of it requires that the schools open.
There you go. That was one of the amendments that was voted down on a strict party line, right?
And who is hurt by that the most?
Children.
Children who can't go to school, whose parents maybe they have one parent in the home. Even if they have both parents in the home,
they have to work.
And
the child,
they are the
6-year-old is in front of a computer.
They're in jobs that you cannot do remotely.
Yes.
Okay. If they work in any sort of service industry, anything like that, they can't stay home. So who's watching those kids? Well, if those kids are supposed to be doing school online, like you said, and you put a 6-year-old in front of a computer and say sit here for 8 hours, how much do you think that kid actually learned? Who are the people who are being hurt the most by it? And this is government policy. If you want to help those people, stop doing the things that's hurting them. Don't just print up a bunch of money and send it out to them, but keep all the bad policy in place.
Let's take a phone call or two, because I think some of you want to know, well, what can we do? So we'll go to Arizona, KNLB. Martha, thank you for calling today.
Hi. So I don't know what to do to combat this crazy spending that my government is doing. I voted, I work, I'm fortunate, I don't need the COVID relief, but I don't know how many more people I can support if they broaden the welfare base.
Yeah.
And at this point, I'm wondering, it's like, can't we just like change our deductions to zero and I'll pay the government my 33 1/3 or whatever I owe in taxes every year and make them wait for the money? I mean, if we did that in mass, would that have any effect? Because and the international abortions, the things I disagree with morally, I'm being forced to pay for. And I don't know if there's anything I can do to stop it.
Yes. Well, and first of all, the next election is pretty clear, because when you talk about this bill in the Senate, there was not one Democrat that voted against it. It passed 50-49. It would have been 50-50, but we had the one senator from Alaska was out. So you couldn't find one Democrat that said, this might be just a little bit too much. Even the Joe Manchins didn't. Then it goes to the House, and you had one defection, one House member who was a Democrat voted against it. So right off the bat, you have to say, well, if I think this is a bad idea, I don't want to reelect any of these Democrats, because every single one of them voted for it. And she raised a question, Martha raised, about the whole issue of abortion, because one of those, isn't that in this list here that you gave us, Penna? They tried to, yes, the very last one, they wanted to include what's called the Hyde Amendment, and that comes from Henry Hyde, and that would prevent your taxpayer dollars being used to fund abortion. And again, all the Democrats voted against it. And it was just a few years ago that even Senator Joe Biden, didn't he support the Hyde Amendment? So this has become a more left-wing, not even liberal, but a more left-wing vote from the Democrats in the House and the Senate than even what you might have seen under, say, the Clinton administration or even the Obama administration. Fair?
I don't know if you talked about the disappointment of the pro-life evangelicals for Biden, but they were, what were they even thinking in supporting Biden? You do have to look at how these people acted early on in the administration. When you start to look at your vote in 2 years or a year and a half now, for Congress. And, something else, going back to what Lathan said about just the changes that they become permanent. And so, for instance, in this bill, there's so much, I forget how much per child, but there's a lot of money per child if you're of a certain income level, and it's pretty high. And, so these people are getting these big checks. And then there's all this talk, and even Mitt Romney is talking about this guaranteed income for every family. And I'm sure it stops at some income level, but it's pretty high. Again, this attitude by government, and it's being confirmed with bills like this, that people are owed a living, that it's not that you earn the money in a job or you start a business and you make your family part of that business, you work hard. No, you expect the money to come from various transfer programs. We've got all kinds of them. And, as we begin to get conservatives in power and you begin to peel that back, Obama started gutting some of them. And then this administration is gutting it big time and turning things around. And so that whole mindset is a little bit scary, and we've got to stand against it and speak about it.
When we come back, we'll talk a little bit more about what we can do, but we'll be back right after these important messages.
Where does moral truth come from? According to 58% of Americans, individuals determine moral truth. A quarter of Generation Z says society determines moral truth, and morality can even change over time. Only 42% of Americans believe that truth comes from God. I don't know about you, but I find these numbers extremely troubling. It really is a crisis of truth, and that crisis has consequences. Look at society. Evil is called good, good called evil. People with biblical beliefs are called bigots, or worse, they're canceled. But there is hope. The Bible promises the truth will set us free, and that's why Point of View is relentless in our commitment to the ultimate source of moral truth, God's Word. At Point of View, we know that God's truth is eternal, and if we stand together, we can help more Americans apply His truth in their daily life. Help Americans find truth again by giving at pointofview.net. Or call 1-800-347-5151. That's pointofview.net and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
If you'd like to join our conversation, that number is 1-800-351-1212. Penna Dexter, Lathan Watts. And let me just mention as a program note that you probably have received my email that is talking about the fact that we're really facing a crisis of truth. Yesterday, we even talked about that with Michael Yosef. It was interesting. His book is hand in glove with what we're focusing on right now, this attempt of so many individuals to mislead you and not speak the truth. And so that's one of the reasons why we have encouraged you to consider what you might do to support Point of View. In about 8 or 9 days, we're going to have our truth team. And, of course, we'll be talking about that with people like Penna Dexter and Kelly Shackelford on Friday, with all sorts of other individuals. But we actually have a banner that's on our website right now that talks about this crisis of truth, and encourage you to consider what you might do to support Point of View, because, after all, we are dependent upon your financial gifts. And it's coming now to the middle of March. Of course, as you might imagine, a lot of people thinking about their taxes haven't been thinking about supporting this ministry. So if you can help us out, we would appreciate that. Go to pointofview.net, or, of course, 800-347-5151 is the number to call. And that is an opportunity for you to support this ministry, and I hope that you would do so. So, again, that is something that you will see in the email that we've sent out, also in the banner that we have there. And most importantly, let's, if we can, while we're talking about some of the things that were presented last night by President Joe Biden, I posted this piece about when will the president have a real news conference. In some respects, because he did a primetime message last night, a lot of people probably won't be bringing this up. But if you look at this article that we've posted, Penna, the people have gone back and looked at the fact that at this time in their presidency, President Donald Trump and President George Herbert Walker Bush had had 5 press conferences. President Bill Clinton had had 4 press conferences. George W. Bush had had 3 press conferences. And even though he did a primetime message last night, that's not a press conference where you get to ask questions. Matter of fact, as they stepped away, you heard somebody shout one, but that went nowhere. Questions about China, questions about the Middle East, questions about our southern border, which they still deny is not a crisis, which is amazing to me, because when those same individuals were in power back then, the Deputy Secretary of Homeland Security, when we had 1,000 coming across the border in one day, called it a crisis. Now when we've had 6,000 coming across, oh, it's just a challenge. And in the midst of that, one of the reasons people have wondered about why there's not a press conference gets into the issue of the military, because the other day when the president was actually speaking, he had the 2 women that are now generals in the high command. And again, we certainly appreciate women that are in the military, and these 2 women generals have now been appointed to the high command. But in the process, and let's talk about this for a minute, he couldn't remember the name of his defense secretary. That'd be Lloyd Austin. He couldn't remember where Lloyd Austin works. That'd be the Pentagon. And
the guy who runs the outfit over there.
and
is what he said.
There's a sense in which some people are saying, and I don't mean this in negative. I think John Cash does a good job of saying, look, I'm not trying to mock the man, but he's the president of the United States. He's my president. He's our president. He's the one we elected president. And it doesn't seem like he's all there when some of these impromptu things that look like a press conference really take place.
It doesn't. Last night, of course, he had a teleprompter, and any attempt to take questions, they turn off the mic because his staff knows that he's incapable of doing that, or he'll say the wrong thing. I just think it's not really that different from what we should have expected, because that's what happened in the campaign. He was hidden most of the time, hidden away, and he was very managed. And this is a very much of a managed presidency, and that's why he doesn't know the name of his defense secretary, because he probably wasn't very involved in choosing that person. And not knowing the arguments or the background of that man, because that's how you remember a name of someone, is you know about them and you interact. That's an important position, a member of his cabinet. And so that's what they're doing right now. It's a really, really weird time in our history. I hope it's never happens again, that we have such it's a mentally disconnected person. I don't know what his mental capabilities are necessarily. They don't seem to be up to where you would want your president to be. But I do think that there's a lot of nervousness about it among the Democrats. And there's a lot of people there who are at the far left that are running things. And he is just sort of a rubber stamp on things. And he's kind of led around. And so when he does something last night, I watched him walk out. I watched it this morning, actually, on YouTube. And, he just, I almost felt sad in a sense looking at him walking out thinking, this man does not look like the leader of the free world. And then when he begins to talk, even then, it's very, he was comforting and he was empathetic with people in the speech and all of that. But there wasn't presidential strength conveyed at all. And then, when you just look at the lack of knowledge of facts, and that's why he doesn't have a press conference. He's not capable of doing one.
That's interesting that you sort of refer to it as the managed presidency. And the question is, who's doing the managing?
Yeah.
Because that is a fundamental threat to Republican form of government.
Mm-hmm.
Because whoever's doing the managing, you didn't vote for them.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what our whole system of government is based on, consent of the governed. And you did not consent to those people running the country. You consented, if you voted for Joe Biden to be in charge. And he is clearly not. And again, not to be unsympathetic, I actually do I feel sorry for the man when I see him, because he doesn't appear to be even who he was a few years ago, who, I've never agreed with him politically. But that is fundamental to how our country operates, how it's supposed to operate. Consent of the governed, right? And I don't know about you. I don't know who's governing. And so how can I give my consent if I don't know who's really in charge?
Let me raise the question about the military, and I always hasten to add, first of all, we certainly appreciate those of you in the military, but sometimes you have not been well served by some of those above you. Is that fair? And this all happened, this question about his mental competence, when he was, of course, talking about the military. And then in the process talked about maternal size flight suits and a number of other things, which caused Tucker Carlson the other day to sort of make fun of it and said, wait a minute, I mean, again, if pregnant women make the best pilots, well, let's have a whole squadron of them, but you've got to prove that to me at first. And so he was somewhat critical of them. Well, then immediately you've got all sorts of individuals in the Pentagon coming after him because he talked about that. And the answer didn't make me feel very good, because right up front, we want to applaud the diversity of our military. Now, I don't know about those of you around the table, but when you've got the press secretary, John Kirby, saying that the most important issue is the diversity of our military, no, I want a military that is, if nothing else, a meritocracy. And Penna, this reminds me of the conversations you've had for decades with Elaine Donnelly about when we sometimes have let women into the military. We've lowered some of the standards at the military academies and all the rest, and she's given all sorts of documentation for it. But Tucker Carlson is saying, look, I think that, I'm not the enemy. Tucker Carlson's not the enemy, but there's been kind of a full court press against him and Fox News and everything else. The enemy is China. Who has the largest navy in the world? China. Who can control the South China Sea? China. That's where we need to focus that. And if all of a sudden we're lauding diversity, that is not necessarily a good feeling about where the military's going.
It weakens us. And yes, I have over the years. I mean, I've just watched us lose some of these battles that, Elaine Donnelly would talk about the military is not a jobs program. It, as you said, is a meritocracy. We do want the best people. We have high standards. And as they brought women in, they had to lower standards in training a lot of times. And sometimes when they didn't lower standards, women would fail. And then, flights, and being able to fly an airplane when you're pregnant. I mean, it may be a rare situation where you'd have just a crack pilot being able to do that, but you've got a physical problem as you're expecting, and you're there in the cockpit. And I think of the situations you can get in with an airplane. That's just one. That's just one part of it. Then you take all the other categories of diversity. I mean, for instance, your sexual orientation. For instance, whether you decide that you aren't comfortable with your gender and you might need some hormones and surgery. I mean, one of the arguments against pregnant women serving was the fact that they sometimes, when they're deployed, they've got to come home. More, it's much more percentage-wise because you're going to have issues. Well, the same thing when you're not comfortable with your gender and you're needing surgery. So, we've got to change our view of the military back to what it used to be.
I know Lathan has some things to say, so we'll hear from him right after this.
On 3 successive days last week, 3 disturbing stories appeared in my inbox. The first reported that Amazon is blocking sales of the book When Harry Became Sally, responding to the transgender moment. The author is Ryan Anderson, who made a name for himself as a brilliant scholar at the Heritage Foundation and was recently appointed president of the Ethics and Public Policy Center. We occupy a bizarre moment in history when lots of people believe, and others pretend to believe, that a person's sex is not biological but assigned at birth. And if they want to change it, they can do so by altering their body. Dr. Anderson is simply the latest truth teller to be canceled for explaining the science regarding gender. He does so with clarity and compassion, concluding that the best biology, psychology, and philosophy all support an understanding of gender as a social manifestation of bodily sex. The next day, I received a story describing a bill that's been introduced in the California Assembly that, if approved, will require retailers to display children's clothing, toys, and other items for kids together in a gender-neutral fashion. California-based stores selling these products online will have to show them in a unisex or gender-neutral format. Retailers will be fined $1,000 per violation. The bill states that keeping boys' and girls' items separate, quote, implies that their use by one gender is inappropriate. And then a headline from ABC News. A Mr. No More. Mr. Potato Head goes gender neutral. After manufacturing and marketing Mr. Potato Head for 70 years, Hasbro announced a gender neutral new name, Potato Head. They're now reconsidering, but a new Potato Head playset to be released this fall will allow kids to create families with 2 moms or 2 dads. When media giants can cancel truth tellers, when state legislators can bully retailers to blur gender distinctives, when toy makers indoctrinate children, the transgender moment threatens to become a permanent reality. For Point of View, I'm Penna Dexter.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, I want to get some comments, of course, from Penna Dexter, Lathan Watts, and we'll take some of your phone calls as well. Let me say again, I always issue this disclaimer. We certainly value those of you that have served in the military, but frankly, sometimes you've not been well served by some of the people in command over you, and you can't say anything about it. but we can. So, and one other Tucker Carlson comment, I thought it was good. You know, he's talking about who's the enemy. I think it's China. But here's something else. He says the Defense Department has never been more aggressively or openly political. There are at present 2,500 American troops stationed in Afghanistan. They remain there to prevent the fall of Kabul to extremists. Simultaneously, there are 5,000 troops in our own capital, also as protection against extremists, meaning people who voted for the losing candidate in the last election. And Lloyd Austin, that name that Joe Biden can't seem to remember, Defense Secretary, even ordered looking through the entire military to root out anybody that might have a viewpoint that might be something that would cause them concern. But Lathan, let's talk about this for a minute. What's the goal of the military? Is it diversity? I don't think so.
Well, if it is, okay, let's just accept that ridiculous notion for a moment. If it is, it's an all-volunteer force. If you are convinced that what the military needs is a certain number of this type of person, that type of person, then go recruit them. Okay, it's an all-volunteer force. It is well established all the way back to the Continental Army. We have civilian control over the civilian authority over the military for a reason, so that we don't end up like some of these other tin-pot dictator countries where the military takes over. But to your point earlier, those in the military, the people that we admire and love, the multiple members of my family who have served, and they are not being served well. Okay, First Liberty handles a lot of cases in the military.
Yes, you do.
To protect chaplains of all people from being court-martialed, their careers ended for, shocker, acting according to their faith. It's what they were hired to do.
Yes.
Okay. As somebody who sleeps under the blanket of protection that these people provide, and who love and admire them for doing it, I want them to do two things: death and destruction. That is the goal of the United States military. To all of our enemies, death and destruction. Whatever makes the U.S. military more efficient and the most elite killing machine in the history of the world, that should be the policy of the U.S. military. If you can show me that an all-pregnant Air Force makes them the most lethal Air Force in the history of the world, I'll be the first one to say, okay, let's get a bunch of pregnant women and put them in bombers and fighter jets. I don't think that's the case. But if you can prove that it is, I'll be the first one to say, let's do that, because that's what the military exists to do. Now, there are some exceptions that prove the rule, right? When there's a massive, like natural disaster, sometimes you may see the National Guard come in and help. Okay, but as I said, that's the exception that proves the rule. The military's job is to defeat our enemies. Whatever makes them better at that and makes them the best at that, that should be the policy. That should be the only guiding principle of any civilian political leader who has anything to do with the United States military. And so, no, diversity is not the number one goal of the military. It's killing people and breaking things. That should be the number one goal of the military.
Yeah. Deterrence and maybe fighting a war. You know, one of the things that Tucker Carlson said, and I'll quote from him, and then we'll move on, but he said, if China moved against Taiwan, how would we respond? I do wonder. More likely, if China decided to close international shipping lanes, it would cripple our economy. If they decided to shut down the internet, it would bring our life to a halt. If they decided to occupy Malaysia, that'd be a grave concern to the world. If any of these things or 100 other things that might take place actually happen, what exactly would our Pentagon do about it? Can the United States military still win a real war? We're not talking about one of those over there in Syria and dropping some bombs. We're talking about whether or not the greatest adversary we face in the 21st century is not Russia, and it isn't even Islamic terrorism, although that is a threat. The greatest adversary we face is China. And when we keep talking about the fact that we are going to, in many cases, try to work with China, and we're not going to confront China as the previous president did,
what does that mean? And if indeed, as you said, if diversity is what our ultimate goal is, or if, as you have talked about, Penna, with Elaine Donnelly, that we've turned the military back in the Clinton years into a social experiment, and we're spending money on transgender operations and all sorts of other things, that's not exactly what the military's all about.
Well, just on that particular issue, transgender, when President Obama opened up the military to transgender individuals, it wasn't just the surgery idea that, some might be demanding surgery in the military, pay for it. It was that across the armed forces, there had to be training of everyone in the armed forces and how to handle this kind of a change, because it was such a momentous change. And so they began that. And these, everyone was subjected to this. And then when Trump came in, of course, he reversed that. And I forget the exact position of the Trump administration, but he basically reversed the mandate for transgenders to be able to serve, and then Biden came back in and he's reversed it again, I believe. So, but it everything that's done in the military like that, decisions that are made that are for diversity, you have to then get trainers and you have to get programs. You take time away from learning the core mission of the military, which Lathan so eloquently described. So, all these things are happening. You have to retrofit, for instance, facilities and make changes. If you're going to change who is, what way you're defined, and whether you're going to have privacy or no privacy, which I guess there's less privacy now. I don't know how the military is handling that part of it. But these things are just, that's why to make it a lean and efficient machine takes money, but it also takes good policy. And, the policies are just ridiculous. The diversity it's very harmful to our national security.
It used to be a meritocracy. Still think it is. I'm not trying to run down those individuals that are there, but some of that has changed. And you think about the last really obvious meritocracy, and that's in sports. Because I'll tell you what, if a coach or a general manager does not put the best team on the field or on the floor, they're going to be looking for another job. And that's, if anything, the best model for what should be in the military, because there isn't so much a meritocracy anymore, Lathan Watts, in some of the other aspects of our society.
No, I mean, whatever the standards are, physical standards are for whatever unit that you are trying to get into, or whatever branch, we should never compromise those standards. And they have been compromised in the past to advance the goal of diversity. We need, we have women in the military, but they're having trouble passing XYZ test to make this rank or to make this unit, and we want them there, so let's change the standards. No, don't do that. We want the absolute best people. I don't care if they're male, female, black, white, Hispanic. It doesn't matter to me. I don't care what the military looks like. I want them to be the best of what they do. And you don't get there by adjusting the standards to somehow tinker with the demographics of who can pass the standards. Again, whatever makes them the best at what they do, that should be the policy.
And again, we do that in SEAL Team, Delta Force, and some of the others. We just need to apply it elsewhere. When we take a break, we'll come back and talk a little bit about some of these religious liberty issues. A very good piece by Lathan Watts we'll talk about right after these important messages.
Where does moral truth come from? According to 58% of Americans, individuals determine moral truth. A quarter of Generation Z says society determines moral truth, and morality can even change over time. Only 42% of Americans believe that truth comes from God. I don't know about you, but I find these numbers extremely troubling. It really is a crisis of truth, and that crisis has consequences. Look at society. Evil is called good, good called evil. People with biblical beliefs are called bigots, or worse, they're canceled. But there is hope. The Bible promises the truth will set us free, and that's why Point of View is relentless in our commitment to the ultimate source of moral truth, God's Word. At Point of View, we know that God's truth is eternal, and if we stand together, we can help more Americans apply His truth in their daily life. Help Americans find truth again by giving at pointofview.net or call 1-800-347-5151. That's pointofview.net and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
This hour, we're going to spend some time getting into a couple of other issues, including this issue of religious liberty. Lathan Watts and Penna Dexter are with me. And before we take another phone call, let me just mention real quickly as a program note, earlier in the week, we did talk about this movie, Church People. And especially since things are sort of coming out of COVID, some of you might want to go to theaters and find out about that. So we did do that interview with Thor Ramsey, and that was really a great interview. But I thought I'd mention one other one. We wanted to get this interview, but it didn't happen. It's called The Father. And of course, we were trying to get an interview with Sir Anthony Hopkins. That didn't work out, but I thought I'd just mention that because it's another one of these films you might want to go to the theater and watch, because if nothing else, especially for a father who died of Alzheimer's, it's really powerful because he plays a man who's in the midst of dementia, and it is very creative and very well done. And so I just wanted to commend it to you. When we see films that are really affirming of human beings or affirming of Christian faith, not this one necessarily, or others, those are some things we like to talk about. So did want to mention that, and you might want to check it out. If you watch the trailer, it's obviously disturbing if you've ever had a parent or a family member that has gone through some kind of dementia or Alzheimer's. But nevertheless, I thought I would mention that quickly as one of the things that we wanted to point you to. But let's take a phone call real quickly, and we'll get into some of these issues of religious liberty. We'll head out to Georgia on the Good News Network. Kathy, I think you have some comments about the president.
Hey, how are you today? I listen to your program all the time. Love what you guys are doing. I just wanted to say that, I guess I'm one of those crazy evangelical women who believe that Joe Biden is not our duly elected president. And I see that all these bizarre, executive orders and everything that's going on, the troops at the Capitol, it's all because they know that he's not even making the decisions. And I feel like that in my heart, and again, a lot of people would discount everything I'm saying, but I just, listening to everything you're saying, it's just so sad because President Trump was making so many strides for Christians, for religious liberty, for freedom, for women. And now everything, we've got this transgender, I have a child in high school, and it's scary, okay? It's very scary. And I just wanted to vent, just listening to everything. It's like, it goes so deep that the deeper you get into it, it breaks my heart. You know what I'm saying?
Sure.
But I know that Jesus is in control, and this all has happened for a reason, and my husband and I are both reading Revelation right now, and we actually listen to it on your station with Vernon McGee, and studying at home in our Bible. But we just, we just have to take heart that at the end of the day, everything that's going on it's going to lead to something very bad, but I feel like God's people, we're going to be okay. But it's still nevertheless hard, and when you're in the middle of it, You know what I'm saying?
Sure. And if nothing else, I think the point she's making is that somebody's making these decisions. I just don't think he wrote all 52 of those executive orders. I don't think he knows what's in it. And there are days when I'm not sure if you were to ask him to name off his cabinet officers, he would be able to do that. And that's not being mean. I just think it's reality.
I think, a president, normal presidents are conversant in the issues. And to not know, I mean, that was just one sort of sign that there's a problem when you can't name the defense secretary. There are many others. There were many during the campaign. You knew that there were going to be others piling up those executive orders for him to sign the first day and many other days. So, I just kind of want to go back and comment on Kathy, because I think that when you look at things like this COVID $1.9 trillion bill, you look at, for instance, H.R. 1, where they want to change our whole system of elections. You look at the Equality Act, where they want to change the definitions of morality, basically. And so you look at that, and as a believer, or even as a person that loves their country that isn't necessarily a Christian, there is a sadness there. There's a lament. And I think it's Lent right now. And so we could lament what's happening in our nation. I think some people try to discern the times that we are in eschatology. I think a more valuable thing to do would be something else that she mentioned, and that is increase your faith, be in the Word, be studying, and then look for ways that you can make changes. A lot of it happens through supporting the right people that are running for office, but other ways too, many ways that you can be a force for good and for Christ in the culture. We try to do that here at Point of View. And, this is a time to do that. I think it's a time to be very discerning about our country, the things we've done right and the things we've done wrong, and, do some reforming. But let's not throw out everything good. And that's, I think, what they're trying to do right now. They're throwing out a system that was actually very well thought out and enshrined in our Constitution. They're trying to throw it out. And if we're going to stand for anything, talk about being brave and bold. Mm-hmm. We need to be brave and bold right now.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things Kathy mentioned, she said they were reading Revelation. It's like, well, the good news is you can sort of read, fast forward to the end and figure out who wins.
Yes.
Right? We win. Okay?
Yeah, that's good to know.
But to her point, so that's sometimes when you're in the middle of something, maintaining perspective is tough to do. And she's right. Everything does happen for a reason. Sometimes the reason is we're dumb and we make bad decisions. And elections have consequences, and, we get the government we deserve. We've put these people in place, but then also to Kathy's point and sort of offering some hope, we have elected idiots and scoundrels many, many times throughout the 240 something years this country's been around, and we're still here. And we'll survive this one too. Policy matters. Yes, we should engage and do what we can. But ultimately, our kingdom is not of this world.
Just before we take a break, I quoted the other day Jonathan Turley, who is a professor of law at George Washington. It's amazing how many times I'm quoting people that wouldn't necessarily agree with us. But he had a great line the other day when he wrote in The Hill. He said the Constitution wasn't just written for a time like this. The Constitution was written in a time like this. He says, back when the Constitution was written, they weren't just trying to cancel each other. In some cases, they were trying to destroy each other and even kill each other. And he reminds us, you have the Republicans and the Federalists, you had the Alien and Sedition Act and a number of other things. And I'm sitting across from a history buff who has certainly understood that we, as you've said, have elected scoundrels in the past. We have sometimes not elected the best and the brightest to high office. And we, as a country, have survived. I hope we survive this one, because our history is one in which many times we have had the same kind of problems we have right now. Anyway, we need to take a break, and we'll come back and we'll get into some of these issues of religious liberty right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Research shows that Americans have less and less in common with each other. There is a problem that the majority of Americans share, knowing what to believe. In 2019, Pew Research Center found that 64% of Americans have a hard time discerning truth when listening to elected officials. 8 in 10 Americans believe Republicans and Democrats disagree about basic facts. The inability of both parties to agree on basic facts seems to be one of the only things the parties do agree on. A significant reason for this widespread distrust and confusion is the fact that fewer and fewer Americans share a common moral code. Increasing numbers of people in our nation are abandoning the Bible as a source of moral truth. Here's a disturbing statistic. 58% of American adults believe that individuals, not God, decide what is morally true, according to research done by Dr. George Barna. This problem is only growing worse among younger Americans. 24% of Gen Z, those born after 1998, believe morality changes over time based on society. We're already seeing the chaotic effects of a morality determined by society's whims. Trusting in an unchanging source of absolute moral truth is more than a spiritual comfort. It provides clarity and confidence for navigating all of life's issues that we face every day. You know, on Point of View, we're committed to helping our listeners navigate any issue they may face by relying on God's Word as the source of moral truth. If you know people who need that kind of moral clarity in their lives, consider pointing them to Point of View, where we discuss relevant issues through a biblical lens. You may also consider donating to Point of View so that we can reach even more listeners with the applicable truth found in God's Word.
Go deeper on topics like you hear on Viewpoints by visiting pointofview.net. Pointofview.net.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Once again, if you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Lots of articles we've posted here today on what's in the COVID bill. And as we mentioned just in passing, that states can't even cut taxes based on that. I think that's unconstitutional. The fact that there are no news conferences for Joe Biden. One on 3 news stories that matter. We've covered one of those. We may get to that later, but I do want to get into the issue of religious liberty. And if you did not have a chance to hear the interview that we did with Ken Starr, that was earlier in the week. His book is entitled Religious Liberty in Crisis, Exercising Your Faith in an Age of Uncertainty. Might just mention that Judge Starr's book is not out yet, but we wanted to give you a preview for it. And I think First Liberty is probably going to be doing some things with him as well. But Penna, let's, if we can, get into this issue, because so often we value First Liberty, and he said so many nice things about First Liberty. But if nothing else, I know that Lathan's got some cases he's working on right now.
Yes, and he actually traveled to the Northeast recently to deal with one issue. It didn't turn into a case, but this was just an interesting one where you got a call, and a lot of these things have been happening with COVID restrictions for gathering, and it's really highlighted the, sometimes the lust for power of certain officials, and even some officials that don't have that much authority, that are making trouble for churches. And churches sometimes tend to have, they don't constitutionally, but they, in the minds of many leaders, civic leaders and others, they have less rights than other organizations or businesses. So you got called up to Medford, Massachusetts. Tell us what happened.
This is one of those things. It sounds like a plot to a good TV show. And this article is in our FLI Insider, which is our newsletter that comes out every week. So spoiler alert if you're waiting to read it. But so last week, I guess it was Monday, I was in a meeting close to the end of the day. It was in what we affectionately refer to as the fishbowl, our conference room, that like 3 full sides of it are all glass, so you can see in and out. And this meeting was winding down, and I look over and I see a couple of my colleagues with very serious looks on their face, and they're trying to get my attention, and I finally look over at them, and they're like waving me out, calling me out of this meeting. So I excused myself and stepped out, and I said, Justin's on the phone and needs to talk to you right now. Justin Butterfield, who's Deputy General Counsel for First Liberty. And so I walked into my colleague's office who had him on the phone, and I just picked up the phone, and it's not often that you get a call at 5 p.m. Where the first words you hear are, "Can you get on a flight to Boston at 8 o'clock?"
Wow.
Maybe. I don't know. I get if I can get a seat, if there's a seat available, why am I going to Boston, Justin? So he explained to me what had happened.
Your life.
Right. And, I say in the article, it's not that often that you get a call like this unless you work for First Liberty Institute.
Yeah.
And this happens all the time for us, it seems like. But it was sort of an urgent situation. This was a Monday afternoon. The day before, on Sunday, during the morning worship service of this church in Medford, Massachusetts, a city bureaucrat, I think her official title is like sanitation expert or something, I don't know. She showed up with about half a dozen police officers. And At church, went into the church.
Oops.
The pastor was in mid-sermon, and his own sort of ushers were trying to get his attention, and he finally had to stop his sermon and turn to them and go, "What? What is happening?" And one of them said, "The cops are here." And so he came down off the stage and walked over to a side door, and here's this health code warrior with uniformed police officers. They interrupted the man's church service because they had, according to her, they had received a call. There was some concern that they might be over capacity for the current COVID restrictions,
right?
Which on that Sunday were, I think, 40% capacity. The church could be open at 40% capacity. Now, the following day, the limit was going to go up to 50%. So even if they were, 1 or 2 people over 40%, you couldn't just wait till the next day when the limit would have been 50%. It would have been okay. So they interrupted this man's church service for this congregation there. It's he himself, the pastor, thinks from El Salvador. There's a lot of it's primarily a Hispanic evangelical church there in Medford. A lot of his parishioners, have fled countries where a visit from the police is not necessarily to check up on you,
right,
and make sure that everything's okay. So this, bureaucrat then proceeded to walk into the sanctuary with her phone held up, taking video and pictures, and basically caused a panic amongst these people because they didn't know what was going on. And again, many of them come from countries where the authorities show up. It's not a good thing.
And some of them might have not even been there legally, or they had questions about their green card, all sorts of stuff. Yeah.
So this had happened. Justin had been in contact with the guy, and so he called me. We need to get this. We got to get this fixed, basically. So I was able to get a seat on the 8 o'clock flight to Boston. I left the office, stopped by my house. I checked the forecast for Boston on my phone, and the next day it was supposed to be like 18 degrees. So I stopped by the house to grab an overcoat. Luckily, I was already in a suit because I was in a meeting. And landed in Boston around midnight, met with the pastor the next day. While I'm going through this whole thing, one of our litigators in the D.C. office is going through the exact same thing. He and I sort of met in Boston. So I hit the ground, I met with the pastor, gathered as much information as I could. The most interesting thing to me was from this man's church, you can see City Hall. It is literally across the street. Okay, and I asked him, what are your offices? He's like, I'm here 6 days a week. If they were really that concerned about the COVID issues, 6 days a week they could have walked across the street and basically come in and talk to the pastor about, hey, what are you doing?
So there was no warning for this.
No, instead they executed this. This Elliot Ness wannabe shows up like a sting operation, as if he's making crystal meth in there or something on Sunday, when any day of the week they could have walked across the street and talked to him about what are the measures you have in place for COVID. We're concerned you might be over capacity. He would have happily invited her to be there. Look, you can do the clicker. You can count them as they come in if you want. He had machines in his building that I've never seen in Texas, that you step up to it, it scans your face, it tells you what your temperature is. It was saying in English and Spanish you need to put a mask on. Every entrance of this building had one of those things. He showed me all the things that they were doing. This was, as Penna said, a government official on a power trip, frankly, and it needed to be fixed. And so we met. Now, by the time we got there, someone at City Hall had realized they had really stepped in it. Yeah. Because the mayor's office had already contacted the pastor trying to set up a meeting to discuss what happened. So our hunch was they really want this to go away. Yes. And so, we met with the pastor, asked him what his goals were, how can we resolve this? We got all of that. And I basically turned it over to Jordan to handle the meeting with the city, and he did a great job, and we were able to wrap this up. And we're still sort of ironing some things out with the city of Medford, but I dare say they will not be interrupting the church's worship services anymore.
Let me just mention that we have a link to First Liberty, so if you would like to know a little bit more about what you can do for your own church, that is the case. When we come back, I want to get another quick comment maybe from Lathan on a legal issue, because our listeners in Rhode Island are well aware of the fact that we have a senator there, Sheldon Whitehouse, who wants to make sure that if somebody files an amicus brief that we post all the donors that contributed to that organization, which I think, first of all, is unconstitutional, and second of all, might be easily resolved by them taking a case out of California about whether or not some of those individuals are doxxed. And while we're talking about some of these heavy-handed COVID cases, one of the other articles I have posted, climate policy, COVID on steroids. So what could that mean in the future? And was this maybe just a trial run to begin to close down various parts of our economy? So let me take a break, but when we do so, we again encourage you to go to our little banner, which again talks about the crisis of truth. Boy, are we certainly talking about that today in so many different ways, and I hope that we are your source for truth. We hope that you support this ministry. Like I said, a little over a week from now, we'll have our truth team, and we'll be talking about that. But we really are committed to truth, not only teaching it from God's Word, but in some cases, even if you don't believe the Bible, there's just a sense of common sense that's being lost, and we talk about that every day. So if you would consider what you might do to help other Americans find truth, please go to our website, pointofview.net, or of course you can give us a call, 800-347-5151, and help us out. And we will take a break, and we have a couple other legal issues to talk about right after these important messages.
Where does moral truth come from? According to 58% of Americans, individuals determine moral truth. A quarter of Generation Z says society determines moral truth, and morality can even change over time. Only 42% of Americans believe that truth comes from God. I don't know about you, but I find these numbers extremely troubling. It really is a crisis of truth, and that crisis has consequences. Look at society. Evil is called good, good called evil. People with biblical beliefs are called bigots, or worse, they're canceled. But there is hope. The Bible promises the truth will set us free, and that's why Point of View is relentless in our commitment to the ultimate source of moral truth, God's Word. At Point of View, we know that God's truth is eternal, and if we stand together, we can help more Americans apply His truth in their daily life. Help Americans find truth again by giving at pointofview.net. Or call 1-800-347-5151. That's pointofview.net and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Final half hour, if you'd like to join the conversation, 1-800-351-1212, talking about all sorts of issues in the news. Lathan Watts with us, Penna Dexter. And Penna, I thought we might, for just a minute, get some comments from Lathan, because you have a senator from Rhode Island suggesting that if you're going to file a brief for a Supreme Court case or something like that, then we should require everybody that has filed that brief to disclose all their donors. This is something that even the ACLU has expressed some concerns about. But what about that? I thought we'd find out from Lathan about that particular issue.
Yes, well, Sheldon Whitehouse, Senator from Rhode Island, he, if the courts don't rule the way he thinks they should, then he tries to implement permanent solutions to sort of restrict the courts. And even in this particular request that he made, he had a hearing, and he in the title of the hearing, he called it, "What's Wrong with the Supreme Court? The Big Money Assault on Our Judiciary." So if any
that sounds real balanced.
Right. If any organization files an amicus brief, anybody that paid for that brief is going to have to disclose their donors. And so that, he's big on disclosing donors. And, that's kind of a violation, I think, of people's privacy and their freedoms. And he also has a bill to that end. That I think that's why he had the hearing. But, Lathan, talk to us about this effort. And first of all, there were a lot of victories in the last administration and who was put on the courts. And it's a permanent threat to the left. And so, he's not going to accept that so much as, or try to go through legal channels. Now he's trying to actually legislate and change things for justices and judges.
Yeah. There are some on the left who, when they cannot accomplish what they want through the legislative process, they go to the courts to get the courts to make policy. They see the court as just another policy-making branch, which it is not. So when they don't get what they want, or they can't get it done through the proper constitutional means of passing a law and have it signed into law, then they run off and find the right set of facts, the right judge, and try to get the policy made by the court. He doesn't like the fact that there is a conservative majority on the court, and this bill, the amicus briefs are essential to how the Supreme Court operates, because even though that's 9 of maybe the best legal minds in the country, and their clerks are some of the best law students and lawyers in the country, they still need help, right? And that's what an amicus brief is. It literally means friend of the court. Mm-hmm. And First Liberty files a lot of them. We're actually, if I can, not to break my arm, patting myself on the back, we're really good at amicus briefs.
Yes, you are.
So the reason they're important is a case that the court may be listening to, Smith versus Jones or whatever, the issue involved in that case may affect a lot more people than just Smith or Jones. And so if there's a religious liberty impact, we will typically find a person or an organization that would be impacted by that and represent them, do an amicus brief on their behalf, and file it with the court. And it's a way for organizations like ours and others on all ends of the spectrum to point out to the court, have you considered this? We think this is important. This is why you should rule X, Y, Z, whatever that case may be. Now, this White House wants anybody who files an amicus brief, if it's an organization like First Liberty, to have to disclose who all their donors are. Well, that's a tactic that goes all the way back at least to the civil rights era, when the Democrat Party in the South, many of the elected officials were the political wing of the Klan, trying to do things just like this to force the disclosure of the membership lists and or the donors of, say, the NAACP. Gee, I wonder what the Klan would have done if they knew who the members of the NAACP were and where and who their donors were. We recently filed an amicus brief in a case on its way to the Supreme Court where we represent Chinese dissidents who whose lives are at risk if that list is disclosed. And that's the point of why this is the latest in the seeming never-ending supply of bad ideas in Washington, D.C. There's a reason you don't have to disclose membership lists and donor lists, because very bad people will do very bad things when they know who those people are. And it can be more than just, quote unquote, shaming them on Twitter. We represent people whose lives are at stake if their names and information is put out there.
So if an organization's thinking of filing an amicus brief and they have this, if this law would pass, this threat's hanging over their head, they'd be less likely to file it. There would be a lot fewer briefs filed, which would then make the judges have less information on which to rule. And, as you said, all the outside information, the people that are affected that aren't the main litigants in the case or the defendant or anybody else, they're outside groups, but this ruling would affect them.
Right.
So it would just make the legal system worse.
Yeah,
he wants to make it less fair and worse.
Yeah, I mean, the court would have less information to consider going into, say, oral argument. We've seen things that we have put in amicus briefs end up in the majority opinion. Mm-hmm. That's, they clearly read it. It was compelling to them. They asked about it at oral argument. They either got or didn't get the answer they wanted, and it ended up in the Supreme Court opinion. In a case where we weren't one of the primary litigants, but there were religious liberty issues at stake, so we represented people who would be impacted by it, and we told the court what they needed to hear from that perspective.
What happens if you do know those names? Does anybody remember the name Brendan Ike, who was with Mozilla, and his, if you will, crime, and this goes all the way back to our issue of cancel culture we'll talk about in just a minute, is the fact that he was supporting the marriage amendment in California. And when people found out that he had donated to that, they basically forced him out of Mozilla. And more importantly, all sorts of other individuals, Penna in California, that supported the marriage amendment. There were boycotts called against various organizations and the rest. So when
it's harassment.
When we think of Lathan talking about why we believe in freedom of association, going all the way back to the old Jim Crow days when individuals wanted to know who was a donor to the NAACP, the racists there wanted to do what they can to destroy their lives. Now it's kind of flipped, and now the liberals, especially the left, want to destroy the lives of anybody that might have signed on to that amicus brief with the Chamber of Commerce or with First Liberty or a Family Research Council or something like that.
So I know that he also was very critical, and maybe he's trying to send a message to the Chief Justice here. He was very critical in the Supreme Court, I think, not taking a gun rights case or their decision in a gun rights case a couple of years ago. And he was very threatening to the justices. I mean, he doesn't really have a lot of respect for those individuals.
Chuck Schumer, didn't he threaten some justices, right?
Yeah.
In a press conference outside the Supreme Court building when he didn't get what he wanted.
Okay, so this is...
But he was going to, I think, pack
amazing.
the courts or something like that. So anyway, it's their, we've been talking today about the changes that, the left is trying to make in our whole system. And of course, this has been the one area where we felt we have some recourse and power. You can go to courts, and we populate it with many very good judges and justices. And so, this guy's taken them on.
Yeah, this is a threat to the independence of the judiciary, really at its core. I mean, there are lots of others like court packing and other things, but that's what it boils down to, and particularly this issue of making people who file amicus briefs disclose who their supporters are. That's trying to dissuade people from filing amicus briefs.
Yeah,
I mean, First Liberty wouldn't want, if you're a donor to us, we wouldn't want to have to disclose your name and information because we're filing an amicus brief at the United States Supreme Court. Because, as you mentioned, in today's cancel culture, we know what can happen to people.
Sure. Let me just take a break, but when we come back, one of the other articles we've posted here is 3 news stories that matter, and it's written by Spencer Clavin, who's been with us before, and one of the points he makes is the critical race theory and cancel culture, which he says is basically the same thing. So we come back, Penna, maybe we could talk about that a little bit, because in some respects we can talk about Dr. Ryan Anderson, we can talk about Dr. Seuss, we can talk about all sorts of other individuals that have faced this because their names indeed were disclosed. We'll talk about that right after this.
On 3 successive days last week, 3 disturbing stories appeared in my inbox. The first reported that Amazon is blocking sales of the book When Harry Became Sally, responding to the transgender moment. The author is Ryan Anderson, who made a name for himself as a brilliant scholar at the Heritage Foundation and was recently appointed president of the Ethics and Public Policy Center. We occupy a bizarre moment in history when lots of people believe, and others pretend to believe, that a person's sex is not biological but assigned at birth. And if they want to change it, they can do so by altering their body. Dr. Anderson is simply the latest truth teller to be canceled for explaining the science regarding gender. He does so with clarity and compassion, concluding that the best biology, psychology, and philosophy all support an understanding of gender as a social manifestation of bodily sex. The next day, I received a story describing a bill that's been introduced in the California Assembly that, if approved, will require retailers to display children's clothing, toys, and other items for kids together in a gender-neutral fashion. California-based stores selling these products online will have to show them in a unisex or gender-neutral format. Retailers will be fined $1,000 per violation. The bill states that keeping boys' and girls' items separate, quote, implies that their use by one gender is inappropriate. And then a headline from ABC News. A Mr. No More. Mr. Potato Head goes gender neutral. After manufacturing and marketing Mr. Potato Head for 70 years, Hasbro announced a gender-neutral new name, Potato Head. They're now reconsidering, but a new Potato Head playset to be released this fall will allow kids to create families with 2 moms or 2 dads. When media giants can cancel truth tellers, when state legislators can bully retailers to blur gender distinctives, when toy makers indoctrinate children, the transgender moment threatens to become a permanent reality. For Point of View, I'm Penna Dexter.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes. Let me just mention that we have Lathan Watts with us. And of course, you can go to firstliberty.org. But also, you've talked about court packing. And then this one, the madness of America's march towards tyranny. And those are at firstlibertylive.com. So you have to remember a little bit more. And I think if you just simply go to First Liberty and click on that first button, it will take you there. But in some respects, I thought for just a minute you might talk about some of these, because these First Liberty Live series are ones that I'm encouraging people to watch either live or you can go back and watch it later. And this is an attempt to take some of these ideas that get a little bit difficult to understand and put them in a video format. So what's exactly there and how can people sign up?
Yeah, just as you said, firstlibertylive.com, we basically had to go to its own separate site to house our proprietary content, the stuff that we produce. And this is a way to sort of get around some of the algorithms and some of the other stuff on the internet. As far as social media, it is, we produce the content, we host it, you come to our site, you can see it, right? So firstlibertylive.com is where that series, you can always find it. And we do interviews. Sometimes it's with our attorneys explaining things. Sometimes it's with clients and explaining what's going on with them. So it's a little bit of everything. So, but it's designed to be informative and, entertaining. It's in a way that, as you were saying, Kerby, can sometimes take something that's complex, make it a little easier to understand in a format that is, fun to watch. So like back before, right around Super Bowl time, we did a First Liberty Live, and we had, I just blanked on his name, Dwight Clark. He was part of the very first post-game prayer huddle in the NFL. Mm-hmm. We had him on with Coach Kennedy, drawing the parallels and telling the stories. Our chief legal officer, Jeff Mateer, just did one yesterday on court packing, I believe was the topic that he was talking about. I
want to talk about the upcoming ones because next Thursday, Christine Pratt will be there. And this is a question a lot of people have been asking, Penna. Will there be a religious exemption for COVID vaccines? Now, I've been talking about vaccines and even keeping track of anybody that has died taking the vaccine, others that have raised questions. So that's one. And then Keisha Russell's been on with us a number of times, and she's going to talk about the dangerous effects of the Equality Act the next Thursday. So really, I'm just trying to preview some of these reasons why people need to sign up.
Yeah, absolutely. And you can do that at our main website that hopefully if you listen and you've heard folks on here before, firstliberty.org. You can always find everything there. Okay. If you can't remember two websites, go to firstliberty.org. And that will connect you to how you can sign up. Yeah. There you go.
We have a link on the website.
And if you're really involved with First Liberty and signed up, you'll get notified when there is a new First Liberty Live up anyway.
That's right. Yes.
So that's the way I keep from missing them. I keep it there. If I don't get to watch it live, I still have it, something to watch.
Yeah, and if you know anything about some of the issues, like I said, with algorithms and things like that on Facebook, and we're all over social media, the best way to make sure that you see everything from us is to sign up and get on our email list so we communicate with you directly. Then you get that email that says, hey, First Liberty Live is about to start, at noon Central. Tune in here.
And a good reason to support you as well.
That's good for everybody except me, who lost her email all day yesterday.
I know.
It was just weird.
It all kept bouncing back. Yeah. And then finally I got a note from you saying I went through. And I said, well, I noticed it's not bouncing back anymore. So we got through. Penna, what about this idea of the cancel culture? Because in some respects that relates to what we've just talked about. And this piece by Spencer Klavan's been on the program with us before. He talks about three news stories. We sort of alluded to one, which was, of course, the question of the invisible president. But this other one is on the cancel culture. And when you talk about Dr. Ryan Anderson having his book pulled, Dr. Seuss and some of those books, and all sorts of people that actually in this article say, I'm even afraid to talk to you. I'm afraid to put my name next to an article because I'm afraid of what will happen to me. This has become a big issue, hasn't it?
It has. This piece, the title is good. There are only three news stories that matter in America right now. And I think sort of the bottom line of it was that, we don't even really know who's in charge because there's different forces now at play. And for one of them is, of course, this whole idea of critical race theory and cancel culture. And I wrote my commentary this week on the transgender moment. So, there's been some cancellations done on that basis. Recently, one of them was Amazon blocking the sales of the book of When Harry Became Sally by Ryan Anderson. And so they basically just stopped selling it, and they also stopped them referring for sales for that. So he's been selling the book for like 3 years. It's such a good book and so successful. And that this kind of came out of the blue, but in a sense, why are we surprised? Then, okay, so In 3 days, I got 3 cancel notices. One was Brian Anderson's book. The next day, I got a story about a bill that's been introduced in the California Assembly. If approved, this bill is going to require retailers to display children's clothing, toys, and items for kids all together in a gender-neutral manner. You can't have the boys and the girls, the pink and the blue, or whatever. California-based stores selling these online have to show them also in a unisex or gender-neutral format, and if you don't do it, you're fined $1,000 per violation. And they want to do this because they don't want to imply that one gender and is more appropriate for certain products. Then day 3, I get a headline in my email from ABC News. A Mr. No More, Mr. Potato Head goes gender neutral.
Lathan is shaking his head.
So they've been making Mr. Potato Head for 70 years. Hasbro announced a gender neutral new name, Potato Head. Of course, there was public outcry on this one. They're reconsidering that move, but they're also releasing a play set, Potato Head play set, that will allow kids to create families with 2 moms and 2 dads. So they're going to maintain that product release. And really, I think the bottom line is we are not in a transgender moment. We may be in a sort of a permanent state where we can be bullied into accepting this ideology unless we stand again with courage against it.
Let me just mention that that's part of Penna Dexter's commentary, which is today to the transgender moment. And Karen put a picture of Mr. and Mrs. Potato Head and some kids on there, so it's really colorful. But as we just mentioned a minute ago, you can sign up for First Liberty Live. You can also sign up to receive the Viewpoints commentary, which we just played a minute ago. Of course, you may have heard it if you're listening on computer. If not, you can get it and just click on the button that says transgender moment, and there's a button that says never miss a viewpoint. And that is where you can sign up. So my commentaries will land in your inbox Monday through Friday. And always on Saturday, I see Penna's commentary landing in my inbox on Saturday. So those are some great resources there. But again, we didn't get into all the news stories that Spencer Clavin talked about, but most of them we've covered. And there are just so many news stories that in some respects, that's why we spend some time every day talking about what's true. I'm running into more and more people saying, I don't know what to believe. And you know what, Penna, sometimes I say on this air, I don't know what to believe,
And we don't know who's in charge. I think people should read his article because it really does kind of support that statement.
It really does wonder about that. But again, one last time, FirstLibertyLive is .com or just firstliberty.org. And you got that. And of course, you'll find all of ours on pointofview.net. You'll see Penna Dexter's commentary today. You have the take action item for H.R. 1, which is now Senate 1. And we better hope that there is always a filibuster, because if not, everything from elections to Equality Act to 2 bills on gun control, if those pass the Senate because they don't have to get anything more than 50 votes, oh boy, we're in a very, very difficult situation. Anyway, I want to thank Doug for him stepping in as our engineer. I want to thank Steve as well. We've got Joel Rosenberg on Monday, got Eric Metaxas in studio Tuesday, so we'll see you back here on Monday, right here on Point of View.
Where does moral truth come from? According to 58% of Americans, individuals determine moral truth. A quarter of Generation Z says society determines moral truth, and morality can even change over time. Only 42% of Americans believe that truth comes from God. I don't know about you, but I find these numbers extremely troubling. It really is a crisis of truth, and that crisis has consequences. Look at society. Evil is called good, good called evil. People with biblical beliefs are called bigots, or worse, they're canceled. But there is hope. The Bible promises the truth will set us free, and that's why Point of View is relentless in our commitment to the ultimate source of moral truth, God's Word. At Point of View, we know that God's truth is eternal, and if we stand together, we can help more Americans apply His truth in their daily life. Help Americans find truth again by giving at pointofview.net. Or call 1-800-347-5151. That's pointofview.net and 800-347-5151. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.